A little girl asked for help without saying a word. No crying, no shouting, just one small, deliberate gesture easy to miss, unless you were really paying attention. Most people didn't see it, but one royal guard did, and the instant he realized what it meant, his face went white. This wasn't pretend. That signal was real, and the girl standing just a few steps away was in trouble. What the guard did next went against everything he'd been trained to follow. But before we reveal what happened, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe because what comes next is unforgettable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of St. James's Palace, as Staff Sergeant Callum Ward took his position outside the grand entrance. For 10 years, he had stood this post, watching the world flow past him like water around a stone. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed in wonder, and dignitaries passed through the gates, but Ward remained motionless, a living statue in his scarlet tunic and towering buckskin hat. What most people didn't know about Ward was that beneath the ceremonial uniform beat the heart of a soldier who had seen too much. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to read faces, to spot danger in the twitch of an eye, the subtle shift of weight that preceded violence. These skills had saved his squad more times than he could count, and they had followed him home to London, where they now served a different purpose entirely. The tourists began gathering as they always did around 10 in the morning, phones raised, voices hushed in that peculiar way people adopt around perceived authority. Ward had learned to tune out most of it. The whispers about whether guards were allowed to move, the jokes about making them laugh, the occasional rude gesture meant to test his resolve. But today, something felt different. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Ward's trained eyes automatically cataloged the details. Expensive car, but not pristine. Rental plates. The driver didn't get out to open doors, unusual for someone wealthy enough to afford such a vehicle. Through years of standing watch, Ward had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, a skill that had kept him alive in war zones and now served him in peace. From the passenger side emerged a man in his late 40s, average height, wearing a navy blazer that was slightly too large for his frame. His movements were quick, almost nervous, and his eyes darted around the area in a pattern Ward recognized, checking exits, assessing threats, calculating escape routes. But what truly caught Ward's attention was the small hand that the man gripped with unnecessary force. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Mia, Ward would later learn, though at that moment she was simply a frightened little girl, whose distress radiated from her like heat from a flame. Her blonde hair was tangled, as if she hadn't slept well, and her clothes, a pink dress that should have been cheerful, were wrinkled and stained. But it was her eyes that stopped Ward's heart. They held a terror that no child should ever know, a desperate awareness that something was terribly wrong. The man, who introduced himself loudly to nearby tourists as Uncle Robert, kept up a steady stream of chatter about showing his niece the famous guards. His voice carried too far, performing for an audience rather than speaking to the child. Ward had heard this kind of performance before, the overly casual tone of someone with something to hide. As they approached, Ward felt every muscle in his body tense despite his outward stillness. The little girl's gaze found his, and in that moment, something passed between them. It wasn't just recognition, it was a plea. Her eyes were asking a question that her mouth couldn't voice. Can you help me? What happened next would haunt Ward for the rest of his life, not because it was traumatic, but because it was miraculous. The child raised her hand, seemingly to wave at him, but instead of the typical gesture a child might make, she did something very specific. She held her palm flat, tucked her thumb into her palm, and then closed her fingers over it. The signal lasted only a few seconds, but Ward saw it clearly. The universal distress signal, a silent SOS that had gained popularity on social media as a way for people in danger to seek help without alerting their captors. Ward had seen a briefing about it just weeks earlier during their monthly security update, though he never imagined he would witness it in person. His blood turned to ice as the implications crashed over him. This wasn't a normal uncle-niece outing. This wasn't a tired child having a difficult day. This was something far darker, and it was happening right in front of him, in broad daylight, under the watchful eye of one of the most secure locations in London. Ward's mind raced through his options, each one constrained by 3 centuries of military tradition and protocol. Royal Guards did not move except in specific circumstances. They did not speak unless spoken to first. They certainly did not break formation to pursue suspicious individuals. The rules were clear. carved in stone by generations of service members who had stood the same post. But as Ward watched the man's grip tighten on the child's wrist, tight enough to leave marks, he noted with growing fury. Those rules began to feel less like guidance and more like chains. The child winced, and Ward saw her try to pull away, only to be yanked back with cruel efficiency. The memory of his younger sister Sarah flashed through his mind unbidden. She had been 10 when the drunk driver ran the red light, 10 when her life was cut short in an instant of twisted metal and shattered glass. Ward had been 17, too young to protect her, too powerless to prevent the tragedy that would define the rest of his life. He had enlisted partly to honor her memory, partly to develop the strength and skills to never feel that helpless again. Now, watching another child in distress, that old helplessness threatened to overwhelm him. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't a powerless teenager. He was a trained soldier with the ability to act. The only question was whether he would choose duty over conscience. The man was growing impatient with the child's obvious reluctance to pose for photos. His voice carried an edge of irritation as he hissed something in her ear that made her flinch. Ward couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The body language told the story: dominance and fear, control and desperation. Other tourists continued to mill around, oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. They saw what they expected to see: a man with his niece, perhaps a bit rushed, maybe dealing with a cranky child who didn't want to be there. No one else seemed to notice the too tight grip, the frightened glances, the way the girl seemed to shrink into herself whenever the man spoke. But Ward noticed everything. It was impossible not to, once you knew what to look for. The child's shoelaces were untied, not from carelessness, but deliberately. Another signal, another small act of rebellion that she hoped someone would see and understand. Her attempts to lag behind, to catch someone's attention, were subtle but persistent. As the minutes stretched on, Ward found himself in an impossible position. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to act, but his training held him motionless. The internal battle was unlike anything he had experienced, even in combat. In Afghanistan, the rules of engagement had been complex but clear. Here, in the heart of London, surrounded by tourists and ceremony, the path forward was murky at best. The man seemed to sense that something was amiss. His movements became more hurried, his grip on the child more possessive. He began steering her away from Ward's position, toward the street where the sedan waited with its engine running. Ward's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. It was then that the child made one final, desperate attempt to communicate. As they passed directly in front of him, she stumbled, clearly intentionally, and in catching herself, managed to meet Ward's eyes one more time. This time, her message was unmistakable. "Help me," her expression pleaded. "Please, help me." That look shattered Ward's paralysis like a hammer through glass. In that instant, all the protocol in the world meant nothing compared to the terror in a child's eyes. Sarah's face superimposed itself over the girl's features, and Ward knew with crystal clarity that he could not, would not, stand by and watch another child disappear into danger. The man was hauling the girl toward the street. Now, his patience clearly exhausted, his free hand reached into his jacket pocket, checking for something that Ward couldn't see but could guess at. Whatever was happening here was about to escalate beyond the point where intervention might be possible. Ward took his first unauthorized step in 10 years of service. The sound of his boots on the cobblestones seemed to echo like gunshots in the sudden silence that fell over the gathered crowd. Tourists who had been chattering and taking photos stopped mid-sentence, their cameras swiveling toward the unprecedented sight of a royal guard breaking formation. "Sir," Ward's voice carried across the courtyard with military precision and unmistakable authority. The single word stopped the man in his tracks as effectively as a physical barrier. "May I see your identification?" The transformation in the man's demeanor was immediate and telling. The nervous energy that had been barely contained beneath his surface performance exploded into full view. His eyes darted around the courtyard, calculating distances, assessing the growing crowd of witnesses. When he spoke, his voice carried a false cheerfulness that fooled no one who was truly listening. "I'm sorry, officer, or whatever you are." The man laughed, the sound too loud and too forced. "Is there some kind of problem? This is my niece, Mia. We're just tourists, you know, trying to show her the sights before we head back to the hotel." Ward's training kicked in fully now, the same analytical process that had kept him alive in war zones. The man's story had holes large enough to drive a truck through. First, he had called Ward an officer, something no British citizen would likely do. given the distinctive uniform. Second, the name Mia had come too quickly, too practiced, as if he had been rehearsing it. Third, and most telling, the child herself had reacted to the name with confusion, a brief flicker of non-recognition that suggested it wasn't actually her name at all. But it was the man's physical positioning that confirmed Ward's worst suspicions. He had shifted his stance to keep the child between himself and Ward, using her as a human shield while maintaining his grip on her wrist. His free hand had moved inside his jacket and stayed there, creating a bulge that suggested he was armed. The crowd was growing larger now, tourists drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a royal guard actually moving and speaking. Phones were raised, videos being recorded that would later go viral. But Ward was focused entirely on the man and child before him. He could feel the weight of centuries of tradition bearing down on him, the knowledge that his career was likely over regardless of how this situation played out. None of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was the frightened child whose life hung in the balance. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Ward repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded respect on battlefields across the world. "And I'll need to speak with the child separately." The man's facade began to crack in earnest now. "Now look here," he snapped, his accent shifting slightly in a way that suggested it might not be entirely authentic. "I don't know what kind of authority you think you have, but you're just a glorified costume, aren't you? Standing around in your ridiculous hat for the tourists. You can't actually do anything." It was a miscalculation that revealed more about the man's psychology than he likely intended. Someone truly innocent would have been confused or cooperative, not aggressive and dismissive. Someone with nothing to hide wouldn't have immediately tried to undermine Ward's authority or questioned his right to intervene. The child, Mia, though Ward suspected that wasn't her real name, had gone very still during this exchange. Her eyes were locked on Ward's face with desperate hope, as if she were afraid that looking away might break whatever spell had brought help to her side. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving, Ward realized, which was highly unusual for a child her age on what should have been an exciting outing. Ward could see bruises now, partially hidden by her long sleeves, but visible when she moved, finger-shaped, marks on her wrists, a shadow of discoloration on her upper arm. The evidence was mounting, and his soldier's instincts were screaming danger with every passing second. The man was edging backward now, trying to create distance while maintaining his grip on the child. Other guards had taken notice of the situation, and Ward could see his colleague Thomas approaching from the left, though still maintaining enough distance to avoid immediate confrontation. The palace's security cameras would be recording everything, and Ward knew that backup would be on the way soon. But soon might not be fast enough. The man was clearly becoming desperate, and desperate people made dangerous choices. What happened next occurred in the span of heartbeats, but Ward would remember it in slow motion for the rest of his life. The man made his decision, abandoning all pretense of legitimacy. His hand emerged from his jacket holding a small pistol, not aimed at Ward, but pressed against the child's back where the crowd couldn't clearly see it. "We're leaving now," the man hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried deadly intent. "And if anyone tries to follow us, the little girl pays the price. Do you understand me, toy soldier?" The crowd began to sense that something was seriously wrong. The cheerful atmosphere of tourism gave way to nervous murmurs and backward steps. Someone screamed. Phone cameras that had been capturing what they thought was a quaint interaction with a guard were now recording what appeared to be an active hostage situation. Ward felt time slow round him as his combat training took complete control. He had faced armed enemies before, but never with an innocent life held directly in the balance. Every calculation had to account for the child's safety first, everything else second. The man began backing toward the street, dragging the child with him. She was crying now, the silent tears of someone who had learned that making noise brought only worse punishment. Her eyes never left Ward's face, holding onto him like a lifeline in a storm. It was then that Ward noticed something that would change everything. The angle of the sun. Mid-morning light was streaming through the trees at precisely the right trajectory, creating a natural spotlight effect across the courtyard. Ward's ceremonial sword, polished to mirror brightness, caught that light and reflected it with laser-like intensity. In Afghanistan, they had called it solar disruption, using reflective surfaces to temporarily blind enemies and create opportunities for tactical advantage. Ward had used the technique more than once to save lives, and now, in the heart of London, he prepared to use it again, with movements that seemed casual to observers, but were precisely calculated. Ward adjusted his position just slightly. The sword's reflection caught the sunlight and directed it straight into the gunman's eyes. The effect was immediate and devastating, a brilliant flash of light that would have temporarily blinded anyone looking in that direction. The man cursed and stumbled, his grip on both the child and the weapon loosening as his hands instinctively moved to shield his eyes. It was the opening Ward had been waiting for, the split-second opportunity that meant the difference between tragedy and triumph. Ward moved with the fluid precision of years of military training. In one motion, he swept the child behind him and away from danger, while simultaneously drawing his sword not to strike, but to maintain the blinding reflection. The man, disoriented and panicking, fired wildly, but his aim was completely compromised by the solar assault on his vision. The bullet struck the cobblestones harmlessly, sending up a spray of ancient stone that had witnessed centuries of history, but never anything quite like this. The sound of gunfire in the heart of London sent the crowd into full panic, tourists scattering in all directions while security forces converged on the scene. But the gunman's moment of advantage was already over. Two plainclothes officers who had been approaching from different angles tackled him simultaneously, driving him to the ground with professional efficiency. The weapon skittered across the cobblestones, coming to rest near a tour group that was frozen in shock at finding themselves in the middle of what would become international news. Ward knelt beside the child, who had collapsed against him in exhaustion and relief. She was trembling but unhurt, at least physically. The emotional trauma of whatever she had endured was written in every line of her small body. But she was alive and safe, and that was all that mattered in this moment. "You're safe now," Ward whispered, his voice gentle in a way that contrasted sharply with the authority he had projected moments before. "You're safe, and you were very brave. You did exactly the right thing." As police swarmed the scene and emergency vehicles arrived with sirens wailing, Ward learned the full scope of what had just unfolded. The child's name was indeed Mia. Mia Collins, age 8, from Manchester. She had been missing for 72 hours, vanishing from a playground while her mother spoke with another parent just 20 feet away. The man was not her uncle, of course. Detective Inspector Sarah Hughes, who took charge of the scene, informed Ward that they had been tracking Marcus Redmond for months. He was wanted in connection with a human trafficking ring that operated across 3 countries, specializing in the abduction and exploitation of children. The network was sophisticated, using legitimate-seeming scenarios and forged documentation to move victims across borders. Before anyone realized they were missing, what made Ward's intervention so crucial was timing. Redmond had been preparing to transport Mia out of the country within hours. A private jet was waiting at a small airfield outside London, fueled and ready for departure. By evening, she would have been beyond the reach of British law enforcement, disappeared into a nightmare that few victims ever escaped. The detective explained that the distress signal Mia had used was indeed the signal for help that had gone viral on social media platforms. It was designed specifically for situations where victims couldn't speak freely, but could make the gesture appear casual. Tragically, Ward was the first adult who had both seen the signal and understood its meaning, enough to act on it. "Most people see it but don't process what it means," Detective Hughes explained, "or they assume it's coincidence, that the child is just moving their hands randomly. It takes someone with your training to recognize it for what it is and have the courage to act, the courage to act." Ward found that phrase echoing in his mind as he gave his statement to investigators. He had broken protocol so thoroughly that his military career was almost certainly over. 300 years of tradition had been shattered in a single moment of decision, and there would be consequences. But as he watched Mia being examined by paramedics, her small voice finally beginning to speak as she described her ordeal to specially trained officers, Ward knew he would make the same choice again without hesitation. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Redmond's operation, and Ward's inadvertent role in dismantling it. When police searched the trafficker's belongings, they found detailed records of his network, including locations of safe houses and the identities of other victims. The information led to coordinated raids across 3 countries, and the rescue of 6 additional children who had been held captive for months. 1 week later, Ward found himself in civilian clothes, for the first time in a decade, standing before his commanding officers to learn his fate. The disciplinary hearing was formal, precise, and ultimately surprising. While acknowledging that he had violated numerous protocols and regulations, the panel concluded that his actions had been both necessary and heroic under the circumstances. Rather than court-martial, Ward received a formal reprimand and reassignment to the palace's security division, where his skills at threat assessment could be better utilized. It was, his commanding officer noted, the first time in the regiment's history that breaking protocol had resulted in promotion, rather than discharge. But the moment that would stay with Ward forever came during the hearing's recess, when a small figure appeared in the corridor outside. Mia Collins, dressed in her best blue dress and holding her mother's hand, had come to see the man who had saved her life. She had made something for him, a medal crafted from cardboard and covered in gold crayon, with "My hero" spelled out, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, as she pinned it to his uniform with the solemnity of a royal ceremony. Ward felt tears he hadn't shed since Sarah's funeral finally break free. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered, her words carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. "Thank you for believing me when I couldn't say the words." Mia's mother, Emma Collins, stood watching with tears streaming down her face. "They told me about the signal," she managed to say between sobs. "I never taught her that. She learned it from a video online, just in case. What kind of world do we live in where children have to learn secret signals for help?" It was a question Ward couldn't answer, but he could offer something else. She was incredibly brave, he told Emma, and smart. She never gave up trying to communicate, even when she was frightened. "You should be very proud of her." The ripple effects of that day continued long after the media attention faded. Ward began working with schools and community organizations to teach adults how to recognize distress signals and signs of trafficking. Mia's story became a catalyst for awareness campaigns across the country, and the signal for help became widely recognized among law enforcement and social services. As for Ward himself, he found that breaking the rules had taught him something valuable about when rules needed to be broken. True honor, he realized, wasn't about standing motionless in the face of injustice. Sometimes it was about knowing when to move. Standing in his new role as security coordinator, watching families tour the palace in safety, Ward kept Sarah's memory close to his heart alongside Mia's handmade medal. He had learned that protecting the innocent wasn't just about following orders. Sometimes it was about having the courage to write new ones. And in the distance, barely audible over the sounds of London traffic, came the laughter of children at play, the most beautiful sound in the world, and the one worth protecting above all others.